Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another ADHD Embrace seminar. I'm Annette Wilson and I'm chair of ADHD Embrace. This evening, we've got a really interesting topic being discussed, the whole subject of executive function, which, we as a group of parents so often, talk about. And we often find that parents actually want to find out more about exactly what executive function is, because it's sort of a word that's been thrown around. And other times we know parents are experiencing it, but they don't know the label to it. So we thought it was a great opportunity to actually have a seminar on the subject. So I'm going to now move over and just introduce you to Victoria. Victoria, a warm welcome. We've got Victoria Bagnall joining us this evening. Victoria is founder of Connections in Mind, and she's a former teacher and had a real interest in this whole topic of executive functioning, and has got a wealth of knowledge. So we feel really privileged to have you here. We're hugely grateful that you're spending this evening with us and sharing all your insights and knowledge. So with that, I'm going to hand the floor to you, Victoria. Thank you.
Oh, that's my pleasure. Thank you so much. And it's so lovely to be with you all this evening. And just to refer you all to the handout in the chat, you just should be able to click on that link, and then hopefully it takes you through to a PDF that you should be able to download. If you are having struggles with it, don't worry at all. The handout will be sent to you as an attachment, and I've already sent that on to Annette so that she can then send that out to you with the recording as well. So if you can't access it, please don't panic. You will get access to it later. But for those of you that can, it might be helpful just to scaffold your thinking this evening as we go through this presentation. So thank you so much for all of that introduction, and I'm going to start sharing my screen so that we can get started with the presentation this evening. Super. So we're going to be talking this evening about ADHD and executive functioning and the connection between the two. And as Annette said, we're going to have a Q&A at the end. So don't worry about kind of holding things in your working memory, because we know that can be a challenge. Do put it into the chat or the Q&A, or just pop it down, just write it down if you've got a pen nearby, so that you can concentrate on learning what we've got to share with you this evening. If we hold too much information in our working memories, we've only got a certain limited amount of space. So it's important to put that down somewhere if you can, so that we can come back to that later. Super. So this evening, we're going to be having an interactive webinar. And that's really because we know that you learn much more if you get involved in the learning. So if you would like to use your QR code scanners, your camera scanner on your smartphone, we're all very good at this now, post-COVID, we know what to do with QR codes. So if you'd like to do that, or if you'd prefer, you can just go to menti.com and then enter this code, which is 32 24 33 73. And Annette, I wonder if you'd mind just popping that into the chat for people so that they've got that for the future. It will also hopefully be at the top of each of the slides as well, where we need your input. So it's 32 24 33 73. And I see someone's just liked the page, which is great. Thank you. That just shows us that you're being able to access it. So that's always lovely to see those hearts coming through. So thank you, everyone, for that. Great stuff. So I've given you the handout. In the handout, you'll also find there's some clickable hyperlinks as well. So if there's any kind of reading and resources that I refer to often, they are in the handout so that you can click on those, and that'll take you through to either a resource that we have, or we'll signpost you towards another resource. We are going to be doing the Q&A, as I said, so please do make a note of those questions as they come up, and we will get to them later. We're going to be talking this evening about executive functions. Then we're going to get into a bit of neuroscience, but I'm going to try and keep that as simple as possible, because I know it can get a bit daunting with the neuroscience. And then we're going to be talking a little bit about how we can support the development of strong executive functions, but we are only here for an hour and a half this evening, so we're not going to be able to get into all of that. So if you want to learn more, please do look out for resources and things that we offer. And Annette and I were just chatting about what we might be able to do as a follow-up to this as well. So do keep an eye out for that if you're interested. So just to practice this, I'd love to have you guys describe the ADHD children that you support in 3 words. And this is going to create a beautiful word cloud for us. So please do get involved. It's so lovely seeing these adjectives coming up to describe the young people that we support, their positive traits and some of the challenges they might have faced too. It's fine to reflect on those. So use your menti.com to enter your 3 words to describe the children you support, please. And hopefully, momentarily, we'll get some words coming up on the screen. Here we go, from the first one. Fast thinking, fun and imaginative, angry, indecisive and creative. Fabulous, thank you for sharing all these. See if we can get a few more coming up. If you spot something that, creative's coming up as a big one. Angry is also coming up as a big one. That's really interesting. Caring, enthusiastic, imaginative, strong-minded, late, yes. Anxious, so often comes along with these challenges, yes. Impatient, impulsive, lively, curious, helpful, but lovely to see those strong words coming up, that fun, creative, caring being a repetitive theme there. The positivity of that is palpable, and really important that we remember the challenges that we face supporting our children with ADHD. You know, they do have so many wonderful things to offer the world. So it's lovely to see there. So thank you so much for sharing that. It's really helpful to just reflect on that before we get started. There we go. So I've learned a very small bit about your children, but I'd just like to tell you a little bit about my story, because as human beings, we learn through stories, and I think it's always lovely to give a context. So I don't actually have a diagnosis of ADHD, although the people that I work with in the field say I probably should go for one, but I don't have a formal diagnosis, but I do identify with having lots of ADHD traits. But I do have a formal diagnosis of dyslexia, which I got when I was 9. And I struggled with my executive functioning all of my life. They didn't quite know what was wrong with me, so they kind of gave me dyslexia as a label. But actually, I think these days it probably would have been ADHD, or if I'd been with quite a progressive psychologist, maybe executive function disorder, which is getting used a lot more these days. And we'll go on to the difference between those and the similarities between them shortly. But despite my dyslexia and my executive function challenges, I have a really strong executive function skill, which is goal-directed persistence, or grit, or resilience. And my French teacher told me I'd never get into the University of Cambridge. So guess what I did? I worked really, really hard and got in to read geography. Did my undergrad at Cambridge. It was exhausting, exhilarating, and not something I probably would want to do again, because of the discrimination that I faced because of my executive function challenges and my dyslexia and my difficulty with my spelling. But it was, a formative part of my life and something I'm very proud of. I'm also a qualified teacher. I have my PGC in secondary geography teaching. I'm a mother of 3 gorgeous girls, one who's 10, one who's 6, and one who's 3. So I really get it. I understand being a parent of a child with these challenges, and my eldest, who's 10, really struggles with these things that we're going to be talking about today. So I really do get it. Connections in Mind is my organisation that I set up with Dr. Bettina Honan, who's a clinical psychologist, and also Imogen Moore-Shelley, who is a research psychologist working at the University of Cambridge too. And we also have The Code, which is a tutoring organisation that offers tutoring, but from an executive function aware lens as well. So it's more kind of subject orientated as opposed to our coaching that we offer, which is more kind of skills based around our executive functioning. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my light bulb moment, and I hope that some of you this evening will have your own light bulb moments this evening as I'm talking about executive function, and a few things will fit into place and you'll think, oh, that makes sense. That changes the way I see lots of things. And we talk about light bulb moments a lot at Connections in Mind, and it's something that we really kind of identify with, is this real change of the way that we view the challenges that we have, that can be really beneficial and helpful in terms of making sense of what we're tackling and the challenges we're facing. So I experienced repeated crisis as I was growing up. Didn't know it at the time, but it was because of my executive function challenges. I was being told by society, by my friends, by my family, by my teachers, by my lecturers, that I just wasn't good enough because I was always forgetting things, and I really struggled to organize my thoughts on paper. And I was just disorganized, always losing things. And so I got a lot of feedback from society that I just wasn't good enough. And so that really affected my mental health. And in my early adult years, I really struggled with these repeated psychological crises that I had. And I really felt like this lady in the little circle here, kind of going around in a circle, tying myself in knots of my thoughts because of not realizing that the challenge that I faced weren't to do with my personality. They didn't make me a bad person, but they were challenges that I faced because of the way my brain was wired. And I think some of you will relate to this, and maybe the young people in your care too. That if we get that feedback from society, it's very difficult to separate ourselves from that. And I'm very proud to say that I don't have these crises repeatedly anymore. And that's because I have this new lens of being able to look at the challenges that I face that make a lot more sense to me. And I'm able to separate myself from the challenges that I face and see it as a challenge that I'm working towards, that it's a skill area that I'm lacking, and that I can work on these things if I want to. And yes, I'm maybe not as good at them as a neurotypical person, but I'm working on it, and I'm more aware and more able to self-advocate around the challenges that I face. And my light bulb moment happened when I read this book. And for those of you with teenagers, I really recommend it. There's also one for kids too. And there's a link, I think, in our handout as well on our reading and resources page. So you can go through and take a look at that. And this book, it was recommended by a psychiatrist that I was working alongside in a particular case of a young lady who was off the scale bright. And I know a lot of parents say that about their children, but I was working as a tutor at the time, and she was off the scale bright. And I could say that very, very clearly because she got the highest ever score in the thinking skills assessment for Oxford University. So this is a really smart cookie. But she was really struggling with her mental health, extreme performance anxiety around exams. She just couldn't get essays written. She couldn't sit down and do revision. And she just really struggled to get things done. We later found out she had ADHD, but she'd been diagnosed with all sorts of other things like borderline personality disorder, obviously anxiety disorders, and so on and so forth before we found out what was going on for her. And so I was working alongside this young lady and her psychiatrist, supporting her. She had to be hospitalized at some points because of the severity of her mental health challenges. But it was this book that really helped me to clarify what was going on for her, but also what had been going on for me. And that just really kind of helped me to think, oh my goodness, we can't be the only two people in the world. And of course not, because there's a book written about it, who this is going on for, and really sparked that desire in myself to do something about it, to educate people so that, you know, these brilliant and bright young minds that are kind of hung out to dry, as it were, by society, and that doesn't understand the challenges that they face. So I jumped on the first plane over to America to go and partake in a training run by Peg Dawson, who is now turned out to be my mentor. And she did training in executive function coaching. I've been to a number of her trainings, and in fact invited her to the UK, and we had the first ever training of executive function coaches in the UK back in 2015. And that's where I met my partners, Dr. Bettina Honan and Imogen Morsheli, and we set up Connections in Mind. And our mission is very small, just got a tiny job to do. We want to change the world. And we want to change the world by helping people to understand that executive function challenges are not character flaws, and it's not to do with our personality, but actually it's to do with a cognitive challenge that we have, and we can improve our executive functioning. But if we can just reframe it and not see people who have these challenges as bad, but actually that they have a skills deficit that maybe they need to work on, but just to be kind to them because they're actually finding this really difficult. It's not because they're choosing to do the things that they find difficult. So yeah, just a small mission, and I'll get on to more about why that's so important as we go through this evening. So we do that in many different ways, but main way we do that is by supporting people, individuals, to overcome their challenges. And so we do that through training. So we do training for schools, we do training with parents, and we do training in organizations as well. So across the board, we also train executive function coaches to work in schools and to work privately. And we have our own executive functioning coaching organization, I should say, which offers coaching one-to-one to young people and adults as well. We also have our Connected Club, which I'll come on to a bit that later, which is for adults who have executive function challenges to get support that they need so that they can be kinder to themselves about their challenges and overcome their challenges in a supportive and nurturing learning environment. So I've been talking a lot about executive functions, and some of you might be sitting there going, oh my goodness, this is all gobbledygook. I don't know what she's talking about. So please do rate on here on Mentimeter your knowledge of executive functions. How would you kind of self-assess? Have you never heard of them before, but we're interested to find out more? Do you know lots about them? Do you know a little bit about them? Are you an expert? Good. Okay, so we've got a few results coming through here. I love this. I'm a geographer, so I love a graph. It's brilliant. And it's kind of like research in action as well, because it happens as soon as everyone fills it out. So it's very engaging for those of us with a short attention spans. It's rather nice. Okay, great. So that's really interesting looking at that curve then. I think we've got a couple more people to fill out, but it's forming quite a nice normal curve there. For those that are interested in the terminology, but it's interesting, just slightly skewed towards the never heard of them before, but it seems that most people have heard a little bit about them. And I'll bear that in mind as we're going through, because that will help inform the work that we're doing this evening. So just to recap then, for those of you that do know, and for those of you that are new to this, this will hopefully help you to understand. Executive functions are the cognitive process, which means the brain processes, which reside in the prefrontal cortex of our brain. And that is the bit of our brain behind our forehead up here. And how does it impact us? Well, the reason they're called executive functions is because they're responsible for the timely and effective execution of tasks. So it's not about developing CEOs or executives of a company, although you do need strong executive functions in order to be a CEO, absolutely. But it's about executing tasks, getting things done. And in order to do that, you need to regulate your emotions. So the emotional regulation is a big piece of that too. People often ask me when I'm talking about this and waxing lyrical and say, everybody just needs to learn about this. It's like, well, how come we don't? They're a bit skeptical. What is this you've kind of dreamt up, you and Peg Dawson? But this is absolutely fundamentally part of the neuroscience. And the trouble is that neuroscientists are really bad at PR, and they're very bad at translating what they know into the public sphere. And it is a complex science, of course it is. And so simplifying that can be difficult. But I do find that most people can access an understanding of executive functioning and what it means, because it makes sense, because it's the way that our brains are wired. And the reason we only have known about it very recently in neuroscience is such a new area of research is because before the invention of fMRI scanners, we weren't able to look inside the brain and see what was going on. So we could have a look at someone who had some kind of brain damage and see, okay, they've damaged their brain, their prefrontal cortex, and they're not able to do these kind of things. Okay, that must be linked. But it wasn't very scientific. It was just kind of like eliminating various things kind of by deducing what might be the areas of the brain that are responsible for things. So the fMRI scanners, we've got a picture of here, really help scientists to be able to look and see what parts of the brain were lighting up and being active when they're asking to do certain tasks. And the research is progressing all the time in this area. So it's a very, very new area of science. But like I said, neuroscientists are really bad at PR and translating what they found in and helping people to understand it. So many teachers will never have heard of this in the UK. We are doing a lot of work trying to work with them, but it is a huge kind of uphill battle because teachers are very kind of overworked and underpaid and don't have time necessarily to engage in new learning. We are buoyed up, though, and encouraged by in America. They're probably about 10 years ahead of us, and it's a much more common term. If you ask an American who lives in the States about executive functioning, normally it's kind of common knowledge. So we do know that we're on that trajectory, and the work that we're doing and other organizations are doing will help people to understand it more. But this is absolutely something based in science. It's not just some kind of idea that someone has come up with. This is fundamentally based in the neuroscience. And who is affected? So everybody, basically. And there isn't a single person on this planet who doesn't have strengths and challenges with their executive functioning. And everybody has their unique executive function fingerprint that is their identity in terms of the strengths and challenges they have. So everyone can benefit from working in these areas, which is wonderful, because it means it's not just something for the SEN department in a school. It can be a whole school approach. And we're working with lots of top schools at the moment, trying to embed a whole school approach where the executive functions are talked about regularly and normalized for everybody, not just for those who really have challenges in these areas. So let's just get down to the real nitty-gritty of it all then, because I think it's really important to talk about what this really means in everyday life, because there's lots of abstract terms, kind of executing tasks. What does that mean? Well, it means these things. These are the type of things that you really need to have your strong executive functions for. So meeting deadlines, prioritizing our work, regulating our emotions. Saw that anger was quite a big thing that came up for people there. Inhibiting our responses, so that's to do with sustaining our attention too. Organizing our belongings, but also organizing thoughts on paper, so answering questions, writing essays, holding information in our heads, that's our working memory. Keeping time or being punctual. Somebody put late, I think, in the word cloud as well. And thinking flexibly, so being able to think outside the box, being able to see things from different perspectives, being self-aware, and being able to see how one's actions might be impacting other people too. So just thinking about your children that you've come to this webinar for this evening, which of these areas do they struggle with? You should be able to select as many as you like. And it's going to create a lovely donut for us, this one. Bit like a Krispy Kreme donut, because it's going to have lots of different coloured sprinkles on it. So yeah, just go through that list, and which areas do you think your children struggle with most? Lovely. Really interesting to see that regulating emotions is coming up quite highly there. Also thinking flexibly, prioritizing the work that needs to be done. Interesting, very interesting indeed. Super. And inhibiting responses has also come up as a big one there. So thank you so much for doing that. But it's really showing kind of across the board, there isn't any particular area that's particularly not a challenge. Meeting deadlines are 6 as opposed to 10 for regulating emotions. So there's not a huge amount of difference there, but really just seeing that kind of across the board, these are challenges that your young people in your care, your children are facing. So I want to get on to now the distinction between the brain functioning and the executive function skills, because I think it's really important to differentiate between the two, to identify the differences. So you can go to whole 6-day conferences on this. So I'm going to try and distill that down as much as I can for you. There is a lot of discourse and debate within the neuroscience field about how many executive functions there are. But it's generally accepted that there are 3 core brain functions, and we'll talk about the skills in a moment. So these 3 core brain functions are cognitive flexibility, so that's the ability to kind of mentally play with thoughts, to see things from different perspectives, to adjust your plans if something goes wrong, to be able to see things from, see your behavior from a different perspective as well. So that's kind of the metacognition, being able to look outside yourself and see things from other people's perspectives. Then the inhibitory control, the response inhibition, is to do with our ability to stop ourselves from doing things that we might instinctually want to do. So if, you know, there's a big Krispy Kreme donut and we know we're supposed to be limiting the number of calories that we intake, but it's just too tempting, then that's our inhibitory control at play there. With a working memory, it's about holding information in our head and doing complex tasks at the same time. So it's relatively easy to hold complex information in your head if you are just thinking about holding that complex information in your head. But if you have to do a difficult task at the same time, that can become much more challenging. And so our working memory allows us to hold information in our heads whilst we're doing other things. I often think about mine. It's kind of like, it's kind of, you're supposed to have 7 pieces of information you can hold in your head. I'm trying to ram 14. So there's always kind of bits that are falling out all over the place and I'm forgetting things. So these are the 3 core brain functions, and they're not in little drawers in our foreheads like that. It's instead more to do with kind of this part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. These brain functions happen within that part of the brain, but they're not kind of in separate areas. You can't kind of differentiate them. It's just all this kind of area of our brain that's doing these brain functions. But what does that mean in everyday life? Because, you know, those 3 core brain functions, when they cross over, because they're all mixed together, when they cross over, you can see them in everyday life as these skill sets or these different areas. So there's things around goal-directed persistence, which is the one, remember, that I'm really strong at because, you know, I was told by my French teacher I'd never get into Cambridge, and then goodness, of course I was going to as soon as she said that. So that's can be a big strength for some people, but also it can be a downfall as well. If you can do hyper-focus, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with that, where you just don't focus on anything else, things can fall away around you, relationships, employment, all sorts of things, you know, if we hyper-focus. So it can be a benefit and can be a flaw too. And certainly for me in the past, it has been a flaw too, as well as a strength. Time management, our ability to manage our time. You need response inhibition, cognitive flexibility, and working memory for that one. Again, with planning and prioritization, you need all 3. With sustaining your attention, you really need that inhibitory control. That's really important because you need to not be distracted by the things that are going on. With organization, it's about remembering where you've put things, having a good system. So you need your cognitive flexibility, your working memory. So you can see how they kind of all, these brain functions kind of cross over to create these 11 different executive function skills. And you'll find in your handout that you've got the definitions of all of these so that you can go back and look over them if that's helpful for you. But it's important to remember that we have these skills because it's really helpful when we're working with young people to be able to shine a laser pointer for them, or for them to do it for us, which is more important, on what the exact challenges they're facing. Because if we see someone who's emotionally dysregulated and they're having a tantrum or yelling and screaming, there could be 2 things at play there. Could be because they're really struggling with their emotional regulation and they're really struggling to control their emotions, but it can also be because they're also struggling to inhibit their responses to those emotions. So you can still feel really angry, but not lash out at someone. I have an anxiety disorder as part of my challenges that I have, and I manage my anxiety. It's still there, but I manage my anxiety and I'm not running out of the room, which my body sometimes tells me to do, So I'm inhibiting the responses to those emotions that I'm feeling. So it's really important to be able to differentiate between those 2 areas, to be able to see the difference. Is this emotional regulation that they're struggling with, or is it the response to that emotion that I'm struggling with? And the same way with things like time management and planning and prioritization. Is it that the young person, or ourselves for that matter, is struggling to be on time for things? Do they really struggle to kind of estimate time, to know how long it takes them to do things? Or are they struggling to prioritize what's important first, and they're just not quite getting the kind of the way of filtering through what's important for them to do? So I think that's really important distinction. So this can shine a laser pointer for us on the challenges that we're facing and help us to help ourselves and the young people in our care to really have a vocabulary to talk about the challenges that we face that is much more positive, because this is about skills that can be developed rather than being called lazy, if you could just focus more in class, all these kind of negative things that we often hear in school reports and in feedback from society. So this is a much more positive way of looking at it. These are skills that we can develop. And executive function deficits, and I hate that term, but that's what they like to use in the literature, can help us to explain behaviour. And I think that's really, really important, because on this kind of behaviour iceberg, we have the behaviour that we see, like not doing revision or homework, or calling out in class, or getting into fights in the playground. There's all that kind of behaviour that's seen. But actually underneath that, there's normally an executive function skills deficit. So it's something that the skill hasn't been developed. But also there's a lot of emotion and shame and guilt and feeling embarrassed and overwhelmed that goes along with that too. So we have to remember that this is a really kind of messy situation that's going on under the surface, and we need to help young people to unpack that. And when we work with schools, we work on their behaviour policies, we help them to see that actually if you're punishing children for having these skills deficits, you're effectively punishing them for having ADHD or another neurodiverse traits. So it's really, really important that we understand that these behaviours that we see are the result of a skills deficit, and the best way to improve them is by building that skill, not giving it attention or not suspending a child. That doesn't teach them the new skill that they seem to be lacking. And there's more to it than that as well, so I'll come on to that in a minute. So just thinking about learning now, because I think it's really such an important part of every young person's life, no matter how much we prioritise academics in our own lives, school is such an important part of young people's lives. And really you need executive function skills for everything, for not calling out in class, for ability to self-assess and reflect and grade your own work, to writing essays, doing homework, absolutely doing revision. You cannot do revision unless you have really great time management, planning and prioritization, organization of your belongings, ability to sustain your attention, ability not to get distracted, and then not be on your phone the whole time. So using that response inhibition, and just so many different areas there. You need to have metacognition to self-assess how well you're doing and what you need to improve on. Just is never ending. There's so many executive functions involved. And then writing the exams. I mean, just going back to that case study of the young lady I was talking about, she could not access an exam room. She had to be severely sedated in order to do that. And of course, she wasn't then able to do her best within the exam because of that exam anxiety. Because if you really struggle to self-assess and know how well you're doing, or if you struggle to keep concentrating for the 3-hour exam you maybe have to do, then it can be a really disorientating place to be. And it's no wonder that a lot of young people really suffer with a lot of exam anxiety. And I'll come on to this later, but it's very interesting to see that anxiety and the stress levels can have this kind of downward spiral effect on our executive functioning. And so that makes it worse over the long term too. So just thinking about our brain and our emotions now, this is a really interesting part of the talk. Sorry, I'm just taking a sip of water, just getting a bit of a dry mouth. Looking at the basic neuroscience here. So this will help you to understand a bit about the brain structure. So we've got the prefrontal cortex, which is the bit of our brain just behind our forehead. Then we've got our limbic brain, which is our amygdala. You may have heard of that, which is kind of like the smoke detector or the guard dog of the brain that keeps us safe. And then we've got our brain stem, which is for kind of a more automatic things that need to be done, like breathing and our heart beating and so on and so forth. And this is a really useful model of the brain. That you've got this in your handout as well, but I'll just show you how to do it because it's really useful. And I use it every day in my household with my 10, 6 and 3-year-old. Although the 3-year-old is on the verge of being able to engage with it, the 6 and the 10-year-old definitely can. And And this is the hand model of the brain. So if you just put your hands up like this for me, so it's just like the palm facing the camera. Super. Thanks, Annette. You're doing a great job of giving us a demo there. And then fold your thumb across the palm of your hand like that. So this is your brain stem here, your wrist, and this is your limbic system or your amygdala there. And then your executive functions, your prefrontal cortex, sit over the top. So it creates like this fist. And what's happening is the prefrontal cortex is doing its job of being kind of like the CEO or the conductor of the brain, the air traffic control of the brain, and is regulating what's going on for the amygdala. And that's happening most of the time. But if we become dysregulated, and I'll come on to what causes that later, but if we become dysregulated, if we get triggered and our amygdala decides that we're not safe, then what happens is we flip our lid. And it's a really great kind of metaphor that we're flipping our lid, our executive functions are not working for us, and we are living in this fight, flight, or freeze part of our brain, our limbic system. And they're literally neurologically disconnected. You can see on the fMRI scanners, this is not working. The executive functions are not working. We are living in this instinctual part of our brain, and we're not making rational decisions. And often, what happens when we're in this situation is that it escalates and goes further, because the person on the receiving end of what's happened can be triggered themselves, and then we get into an argument and so on and so forth. So you can both flip your lids, and then it's all, it's all a bit embarrassing to reflect back on later, and so on and so forth. And, in certain circumstances might end up in a violent altercation as well, because you're just not using that rational part of your brain, and it can be behavior that we would be ashamed of, that we would have done if we were feeling kind of consciously making a decision. And so it's really important to remember that our executive functions are there being that control board for our brain, and regulating our emotions the majority of the time, and regulating our behavior. But when various things happen, we do flip our lids, and it's much more difficult for us to use our executive functions to make rational decisions and to get things done, basically. So it's really important to remember that, and great to say, I've said it many a time before, I'm really sorry, love, darling, I flipped my lid, I'm sorry, I apologize, I shouldn't have done that, and reflecting on that afterwards. It's part of being a human being. We all do it, and some of us do it more often than others, and that doesn't mean we're any better or worse than each other. It just means that we haven't developed those skills yet, and we need to work on developing those skills of keeping that lid on, but also being able to make sure that we don't do things that are really harmful to other people when our lids are flipped off, learning what we can do instead to let those emotions out, to regulate again our amygdala to feel heard and understood, so that we can get back to our rational thoughts. So it's a huge skill to have. So just talking about these impacts on the flipping the lid then. So all of these things can make it more difficult for our executive functions to do their work. So stress, exercise, sleep, and nutrition are all absolutely essential in this area. So in different ways. So obviously, the more stress you have, the less your executive functions work. The more exercise you have, the more they work. The more sleep you have, the better they work, and so on and so forth. Nutrition, it's really important to have a balanced diet, but also to eat regularly. So we've all heard of hangry, right? We've all had the toddler who loses it when they haven't had a snack for a while. And in fact, my husband does that sometimes too. Need to keep the sugar levels up. That hangry is to do with our executive functions being disconnected from our more instinctual part of our brain, because our instinctual part of our brain is saying, I'm hungry, I need food. That's the priority right now. I don't care about this rational thought. That's irrelevant right now. I need to eat. And so it's part of our survival mechanism that our brain is put together like this. And it's not a fault of anyone's. It's just some people are more able to regulate than others because they have developed those skills, but also because of these things going on in their lives. So if you lead a particularly stressful life, if you don't do exercise and connect with other people, and that's another really important part of it, if you don't sleep well, and if you don't eat a balanced diet regularly, then all these things can have an impact too. So it's a really delicate balance that we're treading along this area. And I was listening to Adele Diamond on a recent podcast, actually, and Adele Diamond is the foremost researcher. If you're wanting to look up any of the research in this area, she's fantastic, out of the University of British Columbia. She's kind of foremost researcher of executive functions. And she was talking about stress, and there's this myth that some stress is actually quite good for us. And it's not true at all. She's found in her research that absolutely we need to be leading pretty much stress-free lives in order for our executive functions to work optimally. And we need to be prioritizing that for ourselves in order to do our best work, and to show up for our young people that we care for, and so on and so forth. So really interesting to see the latest, and this is, the last couple of years that she's been doing this research. So it's very, very interesting to see this all coming out. Some more research now, which I'm sure will be very interesting to you. So this is coming out of the Harvard Center for the Developing Child, again, another top university. And there's also research coming out of Cambridge as well here as well. So this is all very up to date, latest research that's coming out of these top institutions. But this particular one is looking at trauma and executive functions. They've been studying this for a while now, and they've realized that if a child experiences early childhood trauma, and that's severe or frequent stress for the young person, then that will affect how well the executive function skills develop. And that's very clear from the science. Now, trauma can be many different things to different people. So two children can experience exactly the same event and have different reactions to it. So trauma is what happens inside you as a response to a stimulus. So that's why when soldiers go off to war, like the Iraq War, for example, some of them got PTSD and some of them didn't. And that's because it depends on the way that you experience that event. So it's not to do with like a traumatic event, isn't something you can categorize. It's about what's happening inside the person as response to that. But any severe stress in childhood can really impact our executive functioning. But also excessive stress in adulthood can also affect our ability to use our executive functioning. So everyone's talking about brain fog, really experiencing lots of brain fog during COVID, after COVID. And the main reason for that is because of the trauma that we have been experiencing as a society. We have been living in a constant state of fear, not knowing what's going to be happening, and our executive functions haven't been able to work as well as if we were in a stress-free environment. And so it's really important to remember that and to understand that and to be kind to ourselves about it, because the more we beat ourselves up and say, why can't I just do X, the worse it gets, because the more stress we get and so on and so forth. So that being kind to ourselves and using kind self-talk and being understanding, just like you would do with a close friend who is struggling with those things, is the best way to personally to work on these things, but also to reflect it back to our children too. And being understanding about these challenges is essential. So we've talked about trauma and executive functions too, but I'm sure some of you are going to be saying, well, my child never had any childhood trauma. And it doesn't have to be just because of the traumatic experience. Also, we know from the research and the neuroscience, the genetics plays a huge part as well. And ADHD, if you have ADHD, often it runs in families as well. But what this slide is showing us is that Professor Russell Barkley, and he's like the godfather of ADHD, he's like dedicated his life to the research. And he said in quite a few of his papers that he believes that ADHD and executive function disorder are interchangeable terms. They are exactly the same thing. So if you're experiencing ADHD, what you also have is executive function disorder. It's just a different way of saying the same thing. So that's fascinating, absolutely. But it just kind of makes sense when you talk about the things that we've been talking about this evening. It does make sense in that profile. And he also talks about that the best way to work on these things is to modify the environment and make other accommodations as well. So to facilitate the development of these executive functions. So it's not fixed. Just because we have executive function challenges doesn't mean it's fixed and set in stone. We can work on these things. Also, some of you may have dual diagnosis that you're dealing with, and I won't go into too much detail on this, but it's really important to recognise that executive functioning can be a shared deficit underpinning of various different neurodevelopmental disorders. And this is very recent research, that's just 3 years ago, that this is coming out, and they're beginning to realise the essential role of the executive functioning and all neurodiverse traits that we see. So moving on to a bit more about developmental neuroscience now, I just want to think about when these executive functions come online so that you can know what is kind of age appropriate to expect of your young people that you have at home. So please answer this question for me. In your experience, what do you think is the age range when the human brain is considered to be fully mature? Thank you for those people who've contributed. Oh, interesting, we're on the fence. Is it early 20s or late 20s? Great stuff. Super. Really interesting there. That's coming up that the majority of people are thinking it's the early 20s, and that would society kind of reflects that, right? Because at the time you're 18, you're considered an adult, and then 21 is in some cultures seen as kind of that age of maturity. But actually, the brain doesn't fully mature in neurotypical brains, and I say that because often when you have they call it neurodevelopmental disorders because they think of it kind of on a trajectory or linear approach. I don't necessarily agree with that, but anyway, often it can take longer for these things to come online for those of us with ADHD or dyslexia or ASD for that matter. And neurotypical brains develop and they fully mature around the late 20s, so around 28 to 30 normally. And that's really interesting because previously we thought that brains were fully mature kind of around kind of the teenage years. So we are giving a lot of responsibility to young people who don't have fully mature brains yet. And we'll come on to the kind of order in which they are seen to come online in the next couple of slides. So when do they develop? So those initial executive functions that we're talking about, the working memory, the cognitive flexibility, and the response inhibition, they start coming along in those toddler years. So that's my 3-year-old. I've seen a real shift change from when she was 18 months to now she's 3. We've gone through those kind of terrible 2s, those difficult years of the tantrums and the emotional dysregulation and so on and so forth. And she's coming out the other side, she's beginning to be able to control her responses to emotional stimuli, and she's being able to do those things. My 6-year-old is really developing her emotional control, her sustained attention. She can sit still now and read, a book. We're doing, progressing through the kind of Oxford reading tree and all of that. And we're able to sit still and do things that aren't preferred tasks for her for longer periods of time. She's also able to use a bit of her cognitive flexibility in terms of thinking things through from a different perspective as well. When you're moving on to secondary school, looking at things like task initiations, that's getting started on task, the opposite of procrastination, planning and prioritization and organization, so keeping a tidy bag and things like that. And then finally, when we're at university or leaving university and heading off into the world of work, so our mid-20s to late 20s, time management, goal-directed persistence, and metacognition, the final ones to come online. But yet, if you think about the way the education system is set up, it's set up to reward those people who have abnormally strong executive functions. So they're the people that are doing really well are the ones that have time management and goal-directed persistence and metacognition that is above their kind of normal average age, which is really fascinating. And I think a really interesting way to look at the education system, because actually it's setting up to reward those who are abnormally strong in different areas rather than what's expected of young people at these different ages, depending on the development of their brain. Of course, this is new science, so we can't expect the education system to keep up pace with it, but it would be lovely to start seeing some of this knowledge filtering down into the work that's being done. I think it's also really important to recognise that whilst we can be born with these challenges, or we can have traumatic events that cause us to have challenges in these areas, we can all change our brains, and that's very clear from the neuroscience. We can all develop new habits that help us to overcome the challenges that we face. And I'm going to show us this little video now, which you have linked to in your handout as well, so that you can take a look at that. So let's just have a quick look at this.
It's believed
yes.
much fixed after childhood. But recent advances now tell us they were mistaken. The brain can, and does, change throughout our lives. We can mould it, like plastic. Hence, neuroscientists call this neuroplasticity. But how does neuroplasticity work? Our brain is a bit like a computer circuit board. There are billions of pathways sending messages every time you feel, do, or think something. Some of these pathways are like superhighways. These are our habits, our embedded ways of being. Every time we think in a familiar way, complete a particular task, or feel a certain emotion, we widen the pathway. It becomes easier for our brains to send these messages. Now, if we think about something from another perspective, try a new task, or choose a different emotion, we start treading a new pathway. And if we keep using that path, it gets wider and smoother, becoming a superhighway. And this new way of thinking, feeling, or doing becomes second nature. The old pathway is bypassed and deteriorates. This is neuroplasticity in action. No matter how old we are, we all have the ability to learn and change by rewiring our brains. It takes effort and regular repetition, but everyone can rewire their brains to create new superhighways.
Okay, I'm going to stop that there. So, like I said, there is a link to that on your handout. It's a really good one to sit down with young people and just share that with them, so that they can understand that they can do things differently. Because often when we've been told all the time that we're lazy and that, you know, these are simple things, why can't you just do it? And we haven't had this understanding that we can change our brains, then it can feel very fixed and can be easier to just think, that's just the way I am. I'm not going to do anything about it. So that can be really helpful to just open that doorway to change. And it's really important also to recognize that if you have a diagnosis of ADHD, it is 10 times more difficult to create a new habit. And that's because if we struggle with ADHD, we struggle with our attention. And in order to form a new habit, it takes 60 iterations of a task to form a habit. And so if we get easily distracted by the shiny new thing over there, then of course we're not going to keep going at a new habit for enough iterations for it to become a habit. So we need to put that support in place for young people to make sure that they do something 60 times. And I don't know about you guys, but we're quite a neurodiverse family. So it's really hard for us parents to remember to help support and scaffold those new things every day. And that's why schools are so great environments for doing these things, because those habits and routines that we put in place in order to engage within the school society are brilliant. But routines within the household are so important for doing that, and also modeling using our strong executive functions too. We talked about the rule of 60, and if anyone's interested in reading up more about that, it was Dr. Philippa Lally out of UCL here in London who did this research. I think it was back in I think it was in, again, 2016, something like that. So very recent research as well that said that 60 iterations on average that it takes to form a new habit. So if you think about that, that's every day, that's 2 months. And if you do it once a week, that's quite a long time. It's over a year. So it does take a long time to inform these new habits. And so keeping going at it is really important. So it's easy to see how people with ADHD can feel a bit fixed, because, you know, if you haven't been able to keep going at things for long enough, it can be hard to form those new habits. It's also really important to remember that well-being is so fundamental. I'm talking about our physical and mental well-being is fundamental to strong executive functioning. And so if we haven't got the building blocks, and we talk about these, you know, building blocks that we have here of strong executive functions, if we haven't got them set up, then it's really difficult to work on building stronger executive functions. So we need to feel safe We need to have done exercise. We need to connect with other people within our community, within our family. We need to have experienced fun and play. It's really important, even as adults, doing things that we really enjoy. But also feelings of joy and pleasure and happiness, really important too. Moments of calm. Mindfulness is brilliant for forming stronger executive functions, ability to kind of focus on being in the present moment and to use our focus that way is phenomenally powerful. Sleep is essential, and I know that's really hard because a lot of the time, if you've got ADHD, you really struggle to sleep, and I have always really struggled with sleep as well, so I totally get that. But it's really important to find the routines and things that work for us, that help us to get better sleep. And food as well, and making sure that we've got a balanced and regular diet is really, really important too. So thinking about those building blocks that we had there, would you like to just think about your children and how are those building blocks doing, and what can we do to help? Would you say they're particularly strong? Would you say they need some work? What can you do to help them to build stronger building blocks? Educate yourself, yeah. get to understand these things, try to help themselves with their difficulties. Yep, absolutely. Improve diet, yeah, and helping them to understand why it's important, I think, too. You know, this is really important to help your brain to work optimally. I think that's a very different conversation, and these just are good for you. You know, it does help. You know, I always think that, you know, the old wives' tale of the carrots and the seeing in the dark, you know, that's always gave children a reason why they needed to eat their carrots, but this is a natural reason. Need to get them to repeat tasks more often. Yeah, routines and consistent approaches, having fun and laughing at the mishaps. Absolutely, be kind to yourselves and help children to learn to be kind to themselves, because the self-talk that we have, or the talk that we have with our children, embeds in their self-talk. You know, I don't know about you, but whenever I've done something, it often tends to be my grandmother or my mother's voice going, "Oh goodness, there you go again, you know, you've made another mistake." You know, it's so important that we have that kind of kind talk to our children around these challenges. Yeah, clear routines and clear instructions and not nagging. It's so hard, isn't it? Because the last thing you want to do is nag, but we'll come on to that more in a moment, about the importance of autonomy and the child feeling in control. Super. Opportunities to engage with fun activities with others, so important. And often the sad thing is you know, break times get taken away and all of these things, but it's so fundamental that they're not, because it's the foundations of strong executive functioning. And so play and playtime are absolutely essential. Super. Great. And praise when they get it right. Absolutely. That's so important. Positive reinforcement is really important. So getting on to the last few minutes of our presentation then this evening. So what can be done to develop strong executive functions? Well, I talked about this book. Again, you can get the link from the reading and resources link on the last page of your handout. It should take you through to a page. It's got lots of fantastic reading on there. But these two books are particularly good, The Smart But Scattered. So the purple one is for younger children and the green one is for older children. And there's also a white one, which is for adults too, if you're interested for yourselves. But there is a 3-step approach that we use at Connections in Mind, and we use this through our coach training, through our parenting, and through our work with schools. So this is really relevant across the board. And there are 3 stages to it. Sorry, I should just start by talking about that. This first is connect, the second is collaborate, and the third is support. And I'll talk more about those individually just now. So when we're talking about connection, we're talking about empathy, and it's really important that we learn the skill of empathy. It's a skill. It's just not something that you kind of either have or you don't have. It is a skill, and psychologists get trained for years in how to use empathy within their sessions. That's one of the main skills of being a psychologist or a counsellor or therapist. So empathy is a skill. We need to deploy it to get in the emotional pit with our young people when they're having a difficult time. It's really, really important to do that. And Brené Brown, who's a researcher in this area, I don't know if you've come across her, but she's fascinating. And she talks about the difference between empathy and sympathy. And often we can think we're being empathetic when actually we're being sympathetic. And it's really important to differentiate between the two. Empathy is about feeling for someone. Sorry, empathy is about feeling with someone, get it right, with someone. So feeling the emotions with someone, whereas sympathy is feeling for someone. So it's kind of a top-down kind of thing. Yeah, Brené does rule. She's brilliant. So do lots of listening to Brené, because she's really helpful on all of this stuff too. Also, when you connect, it can be really useful to develop this executive function literacy. If you've got those 11 different skill sets, and you can talk as a family around the challenges that you face, and mum and dad have got their profiles and the kids have got their profiles, and we're talking about these challenges all the time. We do it at home. Really struggling with my response inhibition today because I didn't sleep well last night. I'm really struggling to organize my belongings today because I'm just so much going on. You know, it's really, really important way of talking about the challenge that we have, rather than I'm just feeling overwhelmed. You know, it's all very all encompassing. So really helping to talk about what's going on for us can be really, really helpful. So when we're talking about the collaborate stage, it's all about autonomy. And I cannot reiterate this enough. Children cannot learn the skills we need if we do it for them. And that's really important, because the first thing we want to do as parents is to help our children. But if we do all the executive functioning for them, if we plan all the holidays and the car trips, and we fill out all the forms for them for school, and if we pack their bag for them in school in the morning, we're not giving them those fundamental opportunities to develop strong executive function. So it does take them longer to do it, but it's absolutely worth investing in supporting them to do it for themselves. And, you know, my 10-year-old daughter, she can cook a whole roast dinner all by herself. She's learned all the timings and the prioritization and things like that. And she does need a little bit of support, but she's 10 and she's doing great at that. And it really helps her with her emotional regulation and her executive functioning too. So I have a question for you. Chores are, Adele Diamond and Peg Dawson are really clear on this. Doing household chores is the best way to build strong executive functions. So of these 10 here, which ones of these do you do for your child? I think you can choose as many as you like. But it'd be interesting to see which ones you do choose. We've got things like cleaning their room, tidying their room, getting them started on homework, washing, putting their clothes away, cooking, planning trips, packing. Oh, first person said all of them. Okay, that's very honest. Thank you so much for sharing that. Yes, absolutely. Look at that across the board. Brilliant. Thank you so much for being so honest about this. You know, it's really great to see this real spread here. Good to see that choosing clothes and tidying the room is seen as ones that people feel more comfortable in doing. But interestingly, the washing, doing the laundry is not one that anyone allows their children to do. And children as young as 3 can get involved in doing the washing. You know, my 3-year-old can sort the lights from the dark. She can put things into the machine. I wouldn't let her switch it on. She might put herself in there by accident. But, you know, there's different age appropriate things that we can do around this. So it's really important to think carefully about how you can get them more involved in it. And I tell you, when you ask a 3-year-old to help sort clothes and put them in the washing machine, she thinks it's the best thing ever. And now my 10-year-old, who's been doing it for years, is very happy to put on a load if I need to do it. I don't make her do it all the time, but she's responsible enough to absolutely do that for herself, and she can do it regularly too. So really a really interesting graph there, and one that comes up really regularly, and this is very typical. And I do these talks for all sorts of parent groups across the country, and this is a very typical picture, so don't feel bad, but do try and work on these areas if you can, because it will really help, and the evidence is very clear around that. Almost finished now, before we get onto the Q&A. So part of collaboration is using questions, and what we know from the neuroscience is that questions help a young person, or an adult for that matter, to form a new neural pathway in their brain much better than instruction. So if you tell them what to do, they're following kind of your neural pathway and your reasoning for it. But if you help them to see the reason why they need to do it for themselves by asking questions, then you can help them to create a rationale and a reason for doing that. So it might be, for example, around the washing, let's say we're a 10-year-old and she's, oh, Mom, we've got, a hockey match tomorrow and I haven't got the clean kit. Oh, okay. Okay, darling, that's great. Well done for identifying that. What can we do to solve this problem? Oh, we need to put a wash on. Okay, great. How could you help to do that so that we make sure we get it done? Because I've got a really busy evening this evening. Those kind of questions, so she's beginning to think through, okay, these are the things that I can do if I'm in this situation, if I'm in this difficult situation in the future, and can also set things up for her next time she's got a hockey match, to think ahead and be like, okay, I'm going to have washing, I need to do it, rather than me just being like, oh gosh, darling, okay, brilliant, let's put a wash on, let's do it. And she doesn't have to worry about it anymore. She's like, hands off, I identified the problem and now Mum sorted it out. So, those kind of questions can really help. So I always just say, when a child asks you something, ask them another question back, get them to think of the answer. And maybe you need to break that down into smaller questions that get them to come up with the answer. If you tell them, it will be your neural pathway that's being strengthened, not theirs. So get them to question, get them to think for themselves is really, really important. Also, this quote is from Russell Barkley, again, the godfather of ADHD. And he said, it's really important that we remember that our role is a shepherd, not an engineer. Our role is to provide safe environments and opportunities for development, but we cannot engineer our children to be how we want them to be. It's just not possible. They are their own human beings. And if we provide that kind of safe environment for them, just like a shepherd would, and make sure they've got food and they've got water and they've got access to, in a safe, loving environment, then the rest will come from there. But if we try and engineer too much, they will fight against that. And that is not going to be supportive for them in the long run. So if we want to support, we create that environment, create the environment for growth and development. So that's making sure those building blocks of executive functioning are really strong. And finally, we also can use checklists, reminders, and post-it notes and routines to help develop these strong executive functions too. But don't do that in isolation. So don't just suddenly, the child comes down in the morning, oh, darling, brilliant, I've got this new checklist for you about your morning routine. Here it is. So you need to follow this checklist. They're going to be like, oh, well, Mum's put together another checklist for me. You need to sit down with them, and yes, it will take longer, but sit down with them. And I do this with my children and say, right, we're struggling to get out of the door every morning to get to school. I really want you to learn this skill. It's such an important skill for you in your personal development. What steps do we need to go through? Let's create a checklist together. And I use something called Canva, which you might have come across, and then you can get all these cool like images. You create this checklist. It can be really visual, because lots of ADHD kids really love the visual stuff, and they can check it off, and they don't have to like physically check it off every day, but they're just seeing the different steps there that they have put together and they have ownership of, can be a great fundamental way of help boosting their executive functions and their ownership of this process. Because I fundamentally believe that every young person wants to improve and do better. Unfortunately, society has often told them that they're kind of fixed in this, you're just like that. But we can fundamentally help these young people to develop things, and they do want to deep down to do better. Sometimes it can be really scary to try, because you've tried so many times in the past and it hasn't worked. But fundamentally, deep down, everyone wants to do better, for sure. And my last slide is just to reiterate that whilst this support is necessary for some, that will be your children, absolutely, if they've got a diagnosis of ADHD, but it's good for all. So it's worth speaking to your school about what they can do to put the support in place, because every single young person in every classroom can benefit from learning more about their executive functions, because everybody will have strengths and challenges in different areas and benefit from learning the strategies and skills that they can put together to help them overcome those things. So thank you so much for that. And I'm open to all your questions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Victoria. That was fascinating. Right. Is there anybody who wants to ask a question and raise your hand? No, I think we all trying to absorb it. And there we are. We've got a first raised hand. Let me just see who that is. Oh, no, it's disappeared.
Don't be scared. I'm happy to answer any.
Actually,
Sally Crook, I think.
Oh, there we are. Yes. Okay, Sally, I'm going to allow you to speak. Oh, you just need to turn your microphone on. Yes, thanks.
Yep. Hi, Victoria. Thank you. And one of the things that I've been thinking about with my son is getting him some executive function coaching, because he really struggles with organising himself. And actually, I was already made aware of your of your organisation. How he doesn't have an EHCP, and I'm wondering, and he's in the lower 6.
Yeah.
Are you able to tell me, or how can I find out what the cost would be?
Yeah.
Absolutely. To work with him.
Absolutely. I'm very happy. I hate talking about money. I wish we didn't have to do money, but we do, and we have to pay our coaches. So it's a very high quality service. These are people that have been working with children for many years. This is not just tutors that are just out of university. It's a very different service. So a lot of people ask me, well, if I pay £40 an hour for a tutor, why is it so expensive? It is costly because it's an expert field, and working with these children is demanding and difficult. It is based on a rate of £92 per hour plus VAT for the work that we do. So that hopefully gives you an idea. But if you would like to get in contact with us, I can give you kind of more of an idea of the programs and things that we offer and what that might cost.
I did look on the website briefly, and it also seemed to say that you kind of like did a bit of an assessment first to work out whether or not he was in fact even ready for it. Absolutely. So there's two fundamental parts of success in coaching. And the first is motivation of the young person for change. They have to want to do this work. We can't, lead a horse to water, can't make it drink, that kind of proverb. But also it's the relationship between the coach and the child. They need to feel they can open up to them, that they want to work for them as well. So those are the two most fundamental things. So what we do at intake is we administer what's called the Eureka, which is the University of Rhode Island's Indicator for Change Assessment. And it looks at the child's mindset for change and how much they desire change and how much they're willing to work hard for it. And if they're not ready to work on change yet, it doesn't mean we're like, bye, see you later. We're not ready to work with you. We put them through a different course, which teaches them about their brain, the very similar information to what I've shared with you today, but really kind of a deep dive into that and looking at their mindsets and their beliefs and trying to help them to see that they can do things differently, and it's worth investing the time and effort in this work. And once they're ready, then we can then take them forward. But we don't work with, we're very strict on those rules. We don't work with a young person, no matter how committed and how persuasive the parent is. We won't work with them until they're ready. That's good. And how many sessions, or are they weekly, monthly? How long would you usually go on for?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question. So a lot of the organizations that I said earlier that, in the United States are about 10 years ahead of us. So in the States now, a lot of the organizations like us are saying to parents, it's a 2-year minimum commitment in order to do the work with the organization. We don't do that because we don't feel people have enough knowledge of executive functions yet, but it is a long-term process. So it's not I'm going to do a 10-week session and suddenly things are going to be better. And the reason that is because if you think about neuroplasticity in the brain, and the way that the habits are formed, you need your 60 iterations of each individual tiny habit that we're putting into place, and you can't work on more than 2 or 3 at a time. It does take a long time to retread the wiring of the brain. It can absolutely be done, but it takes time to do that. So the sessions that we have are normally once a week, but also we do have what we call check-ins, which are 15 to 20 minutes, 2 or 3 times a week, which help the young person keep on track. Because if you have ADHD and you imagine you've got your new strategy you're putting into place, you're really excited about the flashcards that you're going to use for revision or whatever it is, and you start using them for the first couple of days, and then for whatever reason you forget to use them, or you get distracted or something else happened and you stop using them. If we wait another week
until we have the next session, that young person could be feeling really deflated, like a failure. Again, another thing they haven't been able to do. So it's really important that at that stage of action and change, that they have more support rather than less, in order to make sure that we catch that early and we can help talk them through that and be like, no, you've got to continue with this. It's really important. We've got to keep going. You can do this, support them, and so on and so forth.
Sorry. So are we looking at about 6 months or so, do you think, or
6 months minimum? Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's my pleasure.
Right. We've got Agnes and Tony. Do you want to ask your own question? I can give you permission to speak. I just need to find them. There we are. Agnes and Tony, do you want to ask your own question? You just need to unmute your speaker. Otherwise, I can read the question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, it was very interesting. Thank you when you were telling us about the maturity of the brain.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it would be very interesting to know what happens with the brain of ADHD child. Obviously, there is a delay, isn't it? Any comments? That's question number one. Thank you.
Okay, that's question number one. Super. So yes, absolutely. With every brain, it's different. So it's very difficult to say, particularly for an ADHD brain per se, but because they have a diagnosis of ADHD, that would suggest the kind of inhibitory control, emotional regulation, sustained attention piece is the one that would be delayed in being developed. And maybe they have strengths in their goal-directed persistence and the self-awareness and the different profiles that they'll have. So it will be kind of a spiky profile that you're seeing probably around those areas. But it's difficult to say like when, someone with ADHD will be fully mature, and if they're experiencing what I call chronic trauma of having ADHD in society today, when you get the detentions, which I see your next question's about, and you get that feedback from friends and so on and so forth who don't understand these challenges, then that can be also compounding and making it worse. And again, this is something that's very new science, so it's nothing that we can be like angry with anyone particularly about, but the society that we live in is very much set up to discriminate against people who have these challenges. So that can compound the issue and make it worse depending on how affected by these things young people are. Some are very resilient and others really get affected by these things. So it's very individual.
So it's an individual journey, basically.
Yeah, it really is, And do you want to ask your second question as well?
I just wanted to ask Victoria's view. I mean, the general literature around ADHD is that often, and I know it's a huge generalization, and you're absolutely right to talk about a child's individual profile. But the general literature is that these children are typically 2 to 3 years more immature than their peers. Would you say that's a fair rule of thumb? I mean, what's your perspective?
I think it's really, really challenging around those areas. I've also seen in the literature them say that, and people often remark on this with me as well, that like people's facial features, you can look younger than you actually are. I'm just about to turn 40 this year, but often I still get stopped and asked for ID at the supermarket, which is great. But, there's all these generalizations that come. I think it's really challenging to start thinking about it like that because it's not linear. And I think as humans, we love to think of these things as linear, and it's complex, it's spiky, it's difficult, and if an ADHD child is in a nurturing and supportive environment where their executive functions are talked about and developed, it may be that they're only 6 months behind you. Who knows? It's really difficult to say. So yeah, I tend to avoid those generalizations as much as possible. Sorry.
Anyway, I'll leave Agnes to ask her next question.
Our son has regular weekly detentions. He is in year 7. How could the detentions be used to support his needs? Any suggestions that we could pass on to the teachers? Thank you.
Yes. So the best thing that your school can do is really take a long, hard look at the behavior policy. If they are punishing him for having ADHD, that's not okay. And it's really important that as parents, we do some work in this area. And I know there are a number of solicitors that are helping schools to understand that sometimes when their behavior policies are discriminatory against ADHD, that is breaking the law in terms of the Disability Discrimination Act. So you obviously don't want to wade in there with a solicitor. So trying to speak to them about that and helping them to understand. I often go in and advocate for parents within schools and help teachers to see that what they're doing, and you can break down all the kind of misdemeanors and things that they've been punished for, and relate that to executive function skills and say, this is all to do with the symptoms of his ADHD. This is not something, a choice that he's making. This is not a behavioral issue. This is to do with his cognitive abilities and his disability in terms of his ADHD. So that's important if you feel able to do that. And then in terms of using that time, it's really difficult, because if a child feels they're being punished, they're going to be in that fight, flight or freeze part of their brain. So they're not going to be able to use their executive functions to start building and developing them. But if the school is a nurturing environment where it's like, you've broken this particular boundary that we have that keep people safe, and the consequences of that is we're going to have some time to reflect and work on your skills in this area, then you might be able to then, in that time that's available for the detention, to then help him to develop the skills of whatever it is that he's struggling with, whether it's speaking out in class or forgetting his homework or whatever it is that's causing these detentions. But it's very difficult to do it within a traditional behaviour policy. It needs to be in a trauma-informed is the terminology that tends to get used. Trauma-informed schools are very good at doing that. And that can be a lot of alternate provisions and PRUs are very good at that, but a lot of more mainstream schools are also becoming trauma-informed too, which can be really helpful.
Yeah, in our chat box, we've got a feedback from Victoria, who says positive reinforcement works, and focus on what he gets right. Even if it's just once a week, but the more often you can.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I just would say that it's really hard to do that if the child feels like they're threatened. I think that's the trouble, because they won't be sitting in the detention. They won't be thinking this is fair. They'll be feeling cross and defensive. And so that's just not possible for the executive functions to work. So it's trouble.
Any further questions? Any other hands coming up? I've got a question, and it comes back to, teaching children with executive functions. I always think parents have got an amazing starting point because they've got their children there the whole time, and, so you can influence them. I admit sometimes we as parents don't always have the skills in terms of how to do it. But in looking at young people to learn, do you find it's more powerful if they do it in a group rather than individual sessions? And have you looked at research behind that, or have you got any experiences in terms of your own work?
Yes, absolutely. It is much more powerful within a group, and we have done some pilots in the area, but the challenge is getting together a whole load of neurodiverse kids to turn up at the same time, at the same place, and go through doing a course in the same journey is uniquely challenging. And so that's what we're doing now with our Connected Club. We're having just drop-in sessions. So there's no commitment, and you just drop in and you can have support and you can have that environment. And we're piloting that with adults first before we start rolling that out for young people. So within a school environment, of course, you can do that, but it's really important that the child self-selects to be there rather than it's something that's done to them. So it's not like, okay, well, you ADHD kids, come together in this room, we're going to do this work. It's more like, we're going to be working on developing these skills. Who wants to get involved? And maybe you can recommend, some people might want to, but seeing as something really positive and skills-based rather than yet another thing that they're having to do extra that other people don't have to do.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. Making it, what they're going to get out of it, rather than being told to attend something. Great. Well, it's amazing. The evening has gone. It's a minute to go before 9:30. So I think we've covered a huge amount. Really interesting talk. And a lot of things for us to think about, and I think a lot more to learn. So it's been a really inspirational talk just to learn and get to know our kids better, and see how we can help them. So with that, I'm going to say good night and a huge thank you to Victoria. Thank you everybody for joining us. It was good to see everybody, and we'll see you at our next talk. Thanks so much. Good night.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, everyone. It's been delightful.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.